Thanks for coming, everyone. I appreciate it. I'm just going to show you a few images to set the scene, and then Mark and I are going to have a deep and meaningful on the couch. The conceit for this book is the Grand Tour, which I assume many of you would know. The Grand Tour, but just to remind you in case you don't, the Grand Tour really started in about the middle of the 17th century. So say 1650 or so, the expression the Grand Tour became current. And from that, we derive the expression a tourist. A tourist was a person that went on the Grand Tour. Whereas, of course, today everyone's a tourist. In any event, I apologise for that, the map of Europe there that's out of focus. I didn't realise it would be out of focus, but there is a red line sort of from Dover down through Central Europe into Italy, which is where the grand tourists primarily travelled to. And then here you see somebody, a grand tourist, in a business class seat crossing the Alps. And there would, you know, out of frame would have been the entourage. I mean, they would take a lot of stuff with them and travel sometimes for years. And you know, the key destinations were really Venice, Florence, Rome, and then Naples. And some would push on through to Athens and other parts of the world, but primarily it was those cities. You know, it was party in Venice, buy art in Florence, look at the ruins in Rome, and then get down to Napoli and approach Mount Vesuvius. That's the really exciting part is nature itself is the spectacle. As I said, these trips could last for years, and they were primarily educational as well as decadent and so on. But now forward. So you can see, you know, the salons buying some pornography and looking over the Roman ruins. And the whole purpose of this was, of course, it was like a finishing school for the English nobility. And the purpose of it was that England would appropriate classical antiquity through the agency of a single class of person, and appropriate the history of Western culture and bring it back to England and build their estates in the manner of classical antiquity. I mean, ultimately, this sort of aesthetic and language washes up in Australia and it becomes banks and golf courses. So that's it's a remarkable cultural phenomenon, what they did, the pretension to appropriating classical antiquity and making it British is extraordinary, and then exporting that all over the world. But as I said, one of the big attractions was Mount Vesuvius, which opens up a different aspect of the tour in the sense that you're not looking at ruins or art or buildings from the Renaissance. In the case of Mount Vesuvius in Naples, the grand tourists would, you know, sort of scramble up the slope and get as close as they could to it, which was to experience something new called the sublime. So whilst they would look at paintings and try to experience landscapes in a picturesque manner, in a painterly manner, they also tried to get as close as possible to nature's awesome power, which was considered to be God-given. And to get as close as possible, it's like almost approaching death. The whole idea of the sublime was to be titillated, although that's too light a word, was to get so close to the awesome power of nature that you felt that your own life was at risk. And that would, you know, open up this wellspring of emotion which was captured under the idea of the sublime. And so anyway, I'm going on a little bit here, but it seems to me that there's plenty in what I've just explained to ask the question, well, how does that translate into contemporary culture? And by that I mean, well, I'm jumping ahead of myself here, so hang on a sec. what I wanted to say was, as the aristocracy was down looking at the awesome power of nature at places like Vesuvius, back home in England, more practical people were firing up all the newfangled machinery of the Industrial Revolution, so up into the mid 18th century and into the early 19th century. And this is a painting of a place called Coalbrookdale, which was called the Mouth of Hell. And it's sort of synonymous with Vesuvius down in Italy as a natural phenomenon. In England, the Industrial Revolution was firing up. And it's that, of course, that would begin the insidious process of creating climate change to bequeath to us the world that we've inherited, which is one where, as a direct consequence of the Industrial Revolution and the ideas of modernity that underpin it, we've now inherited a world which is also something sublime, in the sense that we now have to seriously consider and reflect upon the fact that we have cooked a planet. And so that led me to think about, you know, just as a riddle really, well, what would you do now if you had to design a grand tour? Like, it would be kind of absurd to say, well, we'll go to Venice, Florence, although Venice is in the book, and I'll come back to that later, Florence, Naples and Rome, or Athens and so on, even though those places remain important. And so this, what I have been for a long time teaching a big history class in design schools titled The Culture of Nature. And in that class, which is a series of lectures, essentially history, but history for designers with a mixture of science and philosophy and theology, and really the course is about trying to unpack history in a way that helps us understand the situation we now find ourselves in terms of the Anthropocene. But I always, in that class, I always give the students a creative exercise each year, as well as writing an essay and, you know, doing various other things. But 4 years ago, I decided to ask the class to help me design a grand tour. And so students selected places around the world that they thought were pertinent. And then I had a group of researchers working on this project, and it eventually self-generated into the idea of a book. And of course, you know, if you ask yourself what places would you choose, each of us would have a different set of places. And, you know, I'm keenly aware that there's no pretense to this being an authoritative list of places. It's just my take on it, and in association with my researchers and so on. And it's a little bit unclear, but each of the dots represents a particular place. There are 120 places that we've settled on through a long process of discussion and you know, reflection. And those places are organised into categories. The first category are hyperobjects. The second are paradises. The third are utopias. Then machines, monsters, ruins, and finally instruments. Now, there's 13 hyperobjects which are different to the other categories. The hyperobjects are lenses through which you can reflect on all of the specific places that follow. So there are 20 places in each of the paradises, utopias, machines, monsters, ruins, and instruments. And the hyperobjects are overarching things like the universe, the city, the economy, climate change, big things that provide the intellectual setting, as it were, for all the specific places. So the book tries to combine, it tries to get at the Anthropocene by virtue of looking at the radical specificity of places, individual places. Places as evidence of what we've become and what's happened, or what's happening. But it does that by also connecting back to the hyperobjects, which are these, as I said, overarching categories to which you can refer, or you can contextualise the places within those larger entities. And it seems to me that that's a way of thinking between the radical specificity of the place in which you find yourself now and the generalities of things like the internet, the economy, the universe, and so on. And it requires a certain elasticity to be a contemporary citizen that can stretch between place and how places are made and all of the politics and so on that goes into that. Particularly from a design perspective. I mean, designers are engaged in making real places and all of that complexity. But then you've got to draw an arc to these larger entities, what I'm calling here the hyperobjects. Now, I know that that's not the technically correct use of the expression hyperobject, and some of you will be aware of this. Timothy Morton, the ecological philosopher, if I can call him that, he coined the expression hyperobjects, although I think it was probably in geometers would have been talking, mathematicians would have been using the term before philosophers. But anyway, and his use of the term hyperobject is interesting in the sense that his argument is that, you know, I've got, the specific example he uses is a polystyrene cup. So you can hold that object in your hand and we call it a cup. So we all agree linguistically to call that thing a cup. But to think ecologically, you need to connect the individual entity with its hyperobject other. The hyperobject is all of the polystyrene cups in the world, all the polystyrene cups that were ever made and will ever be made. And you've got to try and connect the simplicity of the single object and multiply it through space and time to connect it to its hyperobject partner. And it's almost as if we need a new language. You need a word, say cup, but then you need another word for the hyperobject cup, which is all the cups in the world. And all the cups, you know, and where they're going in space and time. And if you can do that, then you start to approximate an ecological way of thinking, and that opens up different ethical frontiers, I think. I think that's his argument. Now, so the hyperobjects I'm referring to in this book are not exactly that. But that ecological way of thinking is very much what's driving this book in terms of trying to connect individual places to a larger set of issues, such as the economy, the universe, the sixth extinction, and so on. Anyway, to move on, there's the 13 hyperobjects: the universe, evolution, the critical zone, the body, the city, the environment, ecological footprint, climate change, carbon cloud, the economy, the internet, the sixth extinction, and the Anthropocene. And then we start with the categories, and you can see them in the exhibition. There's no text in the exhibition, just drawings of the individual places, which were done by a researcher of mine, Oliver Atwood. He's done a meticulous set of very cool technical drawings to accompany the texts of all these places. And these drawings were intentionally done in a very neutral, you know, they're just CAD drawings. They're not trying to be expressionistic, they're just technical drawings. Which goes to an aspect of this book which concerns neutrality. I mean, obviously, there's authorship in the selection of the 120 places. Like if I asked you to make this book, you'd have a different set of 120, so it would reflect your biases or interests or whatever. So there's an unashamed kind of subjectivity in the selection of the places. But the approach to the places, if you read the text, you will find that it's not about the author, you know. But nor is it Wikipedia saying just purely factual. This is how big it is and what its history is and so on. There is provocation in the text, but the authorship is essentially disinterested, stays cool, and the whole book is produced in the manner of a guidebook. You know, it's a beautiful, small, based on the Baedeker series of guidebooks. That was the original intent, that it would be a little soft, leather-covered book with a ribbon, and it hardened up, and the publisher had ideas about what they wanted to do, and Berkhuyser did a nice job on it, that's for sure. Anyway, to the paradises. Why are paradises of interest? Well, obviously paradise opens up the ethical questions of dominion versus stewardship, you know, to put it simply, which seems to me to confront pretty directly our questions about our role and our ethical position vis-a-vis a world that is now dominated by the human race, and where humanity is effectively now in the position of being nature's executioner, which is a very interesting historical position for us to find ourselves in, as opposed to the sort of human that would have been envisaged by the original grand tourists trying to reclaim classical antiquity and as well the Renaissance, and take it back to England to edify the human being, or at least a particular class of human being. So they're all very interesting places. I won't dwell on this because we don't have time, and you can look at the exhibition and consider these for yourself. The first one is Apple Park, for obvious reasons. It's a new development by Foster and Associates with a landscape architecture by L'Oreal, and I think I've got a slide of that at the end I want to refer to. There are quite a few conservation projects, you know, or rewilding projects, which is one of the sort of threads through this book, is the optimism that, as well as being the first humans to cook a planet and to have now become nature's executioners, there is also inversely a profoundly optimistic historical phenomenon, which is that we are, as never before, trying to reconstruct ecosystems on a planetary scale. So there's quite a few projects throughout this book which try to, at least insist on including that as something very important. They're not spectacular, they're not amazing design projects that you can, you know, that you'll see in magazines, but they're amazing projects in terms of, they're what I call mega eco projects. I mean, they are massively complex projects in terms of bringing together the scientific community, conservationists and governments to rewild and reconstruct ecosystems on an epic scale. And there's now over 200 of these projects going on around the world. So there's quite a few of those in the book. There are also some works of landscape architecture, but not many. This is not a book of design highlights. You know, some of you might remember that Harry Seidler, the Australian architect, did a grand tour as well. Sort of, it was like a retirement project, but he produced a big volume of, and it was called the Grand Tour, and it was a contemporary grand tour, but it was for architects, and it was about buildings, which is fine. I mean, that's great. But, you know, it was the entirety of history, and it was just architecture. With this book, I decided it's not my interest or my expertise, but it was not going to be just about design highlights from around the world. And nor was it going to be about the entirety of history. That's too much. The only rule that applies to this collection is that all the places in the book are from the 20th and 21st century, so that it would be contemporaneous. Otherwise, it's too unwieldy. But the works of landscape architecture, for example, there's two gardens here in the Paradises section. One, the site of Reversible Destiny in Yoro in the Gifu Prefecture in Japan by the artist Arakawa and Madeline Gins. Now, the reason that's in there is because it's a very interesting project. You know, it's a large elliptical bowl in which the viewer has to sort of navigate this incredibly complex design, and it's designed to actually make the participants fall over. And participants have to follow instructions and use a map, and the whole thing is designed to disorientate the visitor. And the artists have argued through much of their career that if you could jolt your habitual natures, and that could lead to immortality. So the immortal piece is the connection back to Paradises, which in Paradise, of course, there is only immortality, which of course would have been insufferably boring, but desirable in some ways, I guess. The other one is The Garden of Cosmic Speculation from Charles Jenks, the architectural critic, who built his own garden in Scotland. And it's an interesting project because they're, what he's tried to do is he's looked at the history of gardens, which tend to kind of manifest ideas about cosmology, believe it or not, through geometry. Like that's one consistent line through the history of gardens is a manifestation of ideas of cosmology expressed through geometry. And Charles Jenks updates that to follow contemporary physics. So that's kind of interesting. So that's in there. The utopias are, of course, not about landscapes or gardens, but about the city, about human efforts to create a better world. They always fail. The city is nothing but a collection of failed utopias, you could say. And included in this category are also dystopias, of course, and cornucopia, which is just the idea of just consuming as much as you can of everything, and then ecotopias, so more contemporary, recent versions to create parts of cities or whole cities which perform in a more sophisticated ecological manner, which is the latest iteration of the utopian impulse. Most utopias collapse into the sort of the problem with utopias is that they're essentially, they only work if, they can only be perfect if they work like machines. And machines only work if you have a sort of fascist state, and so that therein lies the whole problem with utopias. But the utopias chapter segues into the machines, which are in some cases actual machines, like the bulldozer and so on, and other 20th and 21st century inventions. But generally it's not about objects as machines, but about places as machines, places that do prodigious amounts of work. So the Three Gorges Dam is a big machine, the damming of the Yangtze, which is so big that it's created a wobble in the earth as it moves. The bulldozer is, however, a kind of a classic, and the etymology of the word is frightening in the sense that it comes from an expression that was common to American slavery. The word was bulldoze. To give somebody a bulldoze was to give them, to meter out an extreme form of punishment to a slave. And that has become bulldozer, which now, of course, just means, to be able to push through with great force. But the bulldozer is, with all due respect, it's kind of a dangerous thing that's invaded our cities. We've even got a few on Mars, scuttling about doing things. But what's really scary is, let me just find it, the polymetallic nodule extractor, which is a bulldozer that works on the bottom on the ocean floor. It's a bulldozer connected to a sort of vacuum cleaner that sucks material off the seafloor and sends it up to a ship floating above. And the reason for that is that we're about to open up a new mining frontier, which is hoovering up these nodules on the ocean floors, because those nodules contain precious minerals, or critical minerals as they're referred to, which we need for our high-tech products. And so it also, there are some classic infrastructure projects in here. There's quite a lot of energy projects. There's a lot about energy transition, the solar and the wind and so on. But my favourite is something called the sand motor off the coast of Holland, which is the Dutch have engineered a piece of their coastline. They've extracted material from the seabed offshore, brought it back into the coast and dumped it in one particular place and left it there. And then the literal currents, the literal drift of the coastline, the forces, the natural forces of the coastline itself redistribute this material up and down the coast to reinforce the Dutch coastline against sea level rise. So it's a sort of ingenious, sublime use of technology to manipulate the natural world and harness the powers of the natural world to serve human purposes. So that's a pretty good machine. The monsters machines have created, the consequence of using machines the way we have is often monstrosities. And the monsters come with all of the kind of the baggage of the Frankensteinian, I suppose. Mary Shelley's original character, and her that brilliant literary work, which presents the idea that humans really have to take responsibility for the monsters they create, and it's as if we've failed to do that. And now I think we are moving into a period where, through a widespread interest in environmental issues, and then energised further by matters of climate change, we are taking responsibility for the monstrosities that we have created. So most of the monsters are environmental disasters. I mean, places that are really appalling in terms of the degradation of ecosystems and so on. And there's quite a bit of nuclear stuff in there, and various other... The monsters includes there's one down the bottom here, the stratospheric veil it's called. And it's the only thing in the book that's not real. And it's the only case where I allowed something to come in which has not really happened yet. And the stratospheric veil is monstrous because it's frightening, but its purpose is essentially to spray sulfur particles into the stratospheric level of the atmosphere in order to bounce sunlight back into space. And it seems to me that we're getting ever closer to that becoming an acceptable reality. How it will be administered and which governments do it and all of those agreements and what's involved, the geopolitics of it will be absolutely horrendous, but it's just over the horizon, I think, of being politically acceptable in order to mitigate climate change. There are two other monsters that might interest you are the two walls, the US-Mexican border I've included as a monster, and I've also included the Israel-Palestine walls as monstrous. The reason for that is that the walls simply give rise to the fact that that which is threatening is on the other side, and we have politicians that will forever step up and play that card. The monsters, as they lose their energy, they become ruins. Ruins relates very nicely back to the original Grand Tour. None of these ruins are the ruins of classical antiquity. They're all ruins from the 20th and 21st century. Many of them are frightening. Most of them, they're all very interesting. Some of them are by artists. For example, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. One that I particularly like is Fresh Kills Park, just south of Staten Island in New York, which was the world's largest rubbish dump for many, many years and has been capped with a landscape architectural treatment. So there's a bit of life being breathed back into that completely, utterly destroyed ecology of Fresh Kills. And it contains also all of the material, all the shrapnel from the World Trade Centres, from the two buildings. And then finally, instruments. Instruments in many ways are the most interesting because these instruments are, generally speaking, the sorts of things that where scientists are deriving data and feedback about our environmental conditions, but not nature as something pure out there that's separate to us. It's feedback and streams of data about human-modified ecosystems. And that's really interesting because it's that sort of data and that sort of empirical material that then gets turned into decision-making processes for how we act upon the world. And it's also the sort of material that gets turned through the arts and gets enriched by the arts to develop a full philosophical, spiritual sense of place that will be necessary to humans enduring the Anthropocene, let's say. So the design of the way the book's laid out is this. It's very simple. As I said, it's quite strict and it's like a guidebook. The drawings are very technical and pure and cool and aloof. There's a little map locating the place geographically, and then there's a short, very pithy text that's, as I said, not Wikipedia, not so dry as to be just facts, but not so subjective to be poetry. You know, it's not indulgent, and it's not an over-expression of the author. So the idea is that there's plenty of room for you, the reader, to think what you will. So if there's anything about this book, it's a tool. It's like a guidebook for someone that never leaves their living room. It's an armchair's, you know, it's an armchair traveller. You won't go to all these places, but they're good to think with. So the design is throughout the book this is the template. As I said, the Apple Park in the Paradises chapter is the first of the 120 places. And for example, the way I interpret this place is that I write about it, not in terms of its contemporary architecture by Foster, I write about it as I sort of examine it through the analogy of the monastery as a sort of an elite group of people separate from the world and intent upon a particular purpose. And it relates to Paradise in the sense that, well, quite explicitly, there is a small water body, not quite in the centre of the garden, but in the centre of what is essentially a kind of monastic environment. And the water body is dark, designed by L'Oreal. It's just a dark circle of water with a very small metronome in the middle. And this little metronome just bobs up and down like a pulse, and it sends out a ripple effect through this pool of water. So it's sort of like cosmic radiation, but it recalls the original Paradise Gardens that always had water in them. And then the monastery forms the protective environment, and the monks perambulate around the central garden, albeit here they're not monks, they're all the data workers for Apple. But the whole thing is a homage to Steve Jobs, who is, you know, the first nerd to have ever become a god. So the book begins with that paradise, and then it ends with we've missed one. Anyway, it ends with Voyager, the two Voyager, the golden records that were sent into space to look at they were sent into space to photograph the planets in our solar system, but they were also designed to then continue out into space. And so the two Voyagers containing the records, the golden records, which have information within them about what humanity is, in the off chance that aliens will find them in the future and decode them to understand how we lived and what we were. So these are two extraordinary objects, which it's absolutely ridiculous that any alien intelligence would be able to find them in the infinitude of space and time. But they've pushed out now beyond, they're about to leave the gravitational field of the solar system. Then they've got about another 40,000 years where they've got to get through the Oort cloud, so-called, which is a sort of an array of shrapnel and asteroids. And if they make it through that, then it's pretty much plain sailing for a few billion years. And should aliens find either of these records of humanity, they can decode, they can backdate them. There's a little bit of carbon embedded in the cover of the record that can be backdated, and that the aliens, we assume, would be able to go, oh, right, they sent these out in 1975. Now, by the time these things are found, if they ever are found, the problem will be, of course, that our sun will have exploded and consumed the Earth anyway, so we won't even be here. But it's sublime, it's kind of epic and tragic, but it's also very beautiful. And then the interesting thing, of course, is what's the information that we decided to put on those records and send into space. And you know, it's stuff like how to make a pizza. It's how to make a baby. It's the Sydney Opera House. It's Aboriginal people making music. There's quite a bit of Australian content, actually. And then the record, which is an hour and a half long, ends with a kiss, goodbye. And that's pretty much it for us. Anyway, I would like to take a moment to thank the people, Tatum Hands, edited the book. The research was done by Ian Dillon, Elliot Bullen, Rob Leventhal, Oliver Atwood, Aaron O'Neill and Alice Bell, and the drawings in the gallery were drawn by Oliver. So I've talked for too long, but that gives you, I hope, an understanding of the book, the ideas behind it, the connection to the grand tour, and a reflection on some of its content. So what we're going to do now, I think, is have a chat. Thank you. Yeah. Hang on, what's going on now?
Go to a picture?
Yeah, I think we should go to a picture. Well, we'll put the planet up, shall we?
Hit the play button at the top.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Come and join me on this.
Yeah, okay.
The skewed couch.
Oh.
Good, okay. Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you everyone for being here. This thing, your book is an incredibly beautiful piece of work. I heartily encourage anyone who has any doubts about parting with their $80 to visit Matt at the back of the room later on and purchase this book. It's an incredibly beautiful book about an ugly state, I suppose. And I think the thing that doesn't come through in the exhibition, Oliver's drawings are incredible. The text is just sort of has all that clarity and brilliance and sort of polemicism of your talk just now. So I really do sort of recommend it. I'm sort of glad in a way that you finished where I wanted to start, which was the last image of the book. So clearly it's not a coincidence that the Voyager discs as the sort of last gesture in this book. And for those who don't know the discs, you should buy the book. There's a picture of them in there. You know, there's sort of twin discs of coded information, graphic information, sound information. And for me, they've always had a kind of sort of strange double coding or double-edged sword. Could never quite figure out whether they were sent forth as this sort of fantastic sampling of the state of the world, sent forth into infinity as a kind of hopeful gesture to sort of say, you know, look, come and meet us, or whether there's, I guess, another way of thinking about those discs in 1977, 75, when they were done. The world was a difficult place. You know, I guess there were sort of thoughts about longevity and thoughts about you know, I guess our demise, whether it was through the oil crisis, Cold War, nuclear war, et cetera, So there's a sense about, you know, was the sending the discs out another kind of thing, a sort of a kind of a last statement that was uttered into eternity, a kind of a memento mori of us all. And in a sense, the book, I feel the same way about this book, that there's a way of seeing it as something hopeful, in that you do talk about quite profound projects that can have a great influence on the way we live and how we survive. And at the same time, you know, there's some extremely ugly moments in here. It's a kind of list of last things. And you're right, there is a neutrality and you want people to take their own position about those things. But I'm interested in, since, you know, we're here amongst friends, drawing you out, your position on that. Is this book a sort of a hopeful invitation to action, or is it a preemptive and rather beautiful telling of our demise?
Great question. I mean, it could be both, but this is the problem, I suppose, in terms of curating something like this. If you are to do a creative work of any kind today, each of us has to decide to what degree do you think it's productive that we look fairly and squarely at what we've become and what we've done in a dispassionate way, or as you slide across a spectrum towards sort of glib optimism. So designers are always optimistic. I'm not assuming that everyone in the audience is a designer, but probably all of you are in some way connected to creative work, or even if you're not. Life in itself is creative. Everything we do is creative. But my point is that each of us has to, you have to make a decision, and it's almost like each of us has to now make an existential decision in just how we conduct our lives, what we're for and what we're against, and how optimistic are you? How can you be optimistic now? There's such a body of evidence that would suggest that that's just patently absurd. I mean, the refuge of modernity is just piling up. You know, Walter Benjamin was right. The angel of history has its wings pinned back and is being blown backwards by the storm. And all the angel can see is the debris piling up. You know, the angel is being blown backwards into the future. That's a horrible, frightening image from him. That was in the beginning of the 20th century. But then on the other hand, life itself is full of beauty. You know, at a much more, at a planetary level, we hear a lot about the crisis. But our daily lives are full of nuance and beauty and care and productivity and growth. So I don't know. I don't know how you, and all I'm saying is we all have to try and think through the situation we now find ourselves in. And that's not just existential, it's also geographical. We need to think locally, but we also need to think nationally. We need to think globally, and then we need to think in terms of the planetary. So there's all this, I mean, you need to be, it's almost as if to be a citizen today means that you need to be intellectually equipped in a way that I don't think people have previously in history. Our sense of place is so complicated and so stretched in terms of the space that it has to connect the dots within. And to answer your question, about me personally, I am optimistic about the fate of humanity because I actually think history's been pretty much a tale of woe forever for the people that are in it at any particular time. It's always been couched in terms of crisis. Or alternatively, there have been whole, centuries after centuries where not much happened. I mean, it was just interminably boring. We are living in the most interesting time. That's one good thing about it. But there's now so much at stake because never before has life itself been at stake at a planetary scale. That should scare the shit out of everyone, particularly if we do believe that life is valuable and this is the only example we know of life in the infinitude of space, then we are the custodians of that life now. Surely that's of some significance. But history moves slowly, and I think that the environmental crisis, which has been upon us for at least the last 60 years, let's say, is just the beginning of a longer historical phase of humanity becoming aware of the full nature of the situation that they find themselves in, and are just beginning to take responsibility for their monsters. And that's a good thing, but it'll take time. The problem is, of course, as climate change bears down, there's the geopolitics, and there's the pain and misery that's going to occur over the next few centuries is going to be awful, truly awful. But it was always Maybe not on such a scale, but history is full of the awful.
Look, maybe we can segue from the
Let's
awful
move to something light.
back to optimism for a minute. You did talk about optimism there, and you did, assume that maybe not everyone in the audience was going to be here as a designer,
Yeah.
acknowledging that we are here somewhat under the auspices of NGV's Design Week.
Yeah, right.
I think it might be worth talking about design for a bit.
Yep.
I think that, let's say, except for the universe in this book, all other 132 stops on your tour have been made, consciously or unconsciously, by us.
Right.
I think the universe is the one where we can't kind of recast.
Yep.
And so that bit on the Anthropocene, the line from the book is that, obviously the definition of the Anthropocene in a sense, that the planet is now what we make it, is an interesting sentence, because in a sense it's both a fact, that we've cooked it to your point, it's fucked and we did it, or that idea that the planet is now what we make it might be a kind of a goad or an invitation to say...
It's a design project.
Fix it. Yeah, exactly right.
It's a design project.
So that's, I guess that's the thing, like, can the planet, can the planet we've made bad be made better?
Yep.
And then what's the agency and what's the role of design and its optimism in that remaking?
Yeah.
And I guess what are its limits?
Yeah, right. Well, so when I say it's a design project, I don't mean it's just a designer, a luxury product like a handbag or a fast car or something. I mean that it's the exercise of human intelligence and creativity to shape the world around them, which is what a design project is, except that now it's happening at such at a planetary scale. And some of that is extractive and exploitative, and some of it is increasingly about reconstructing ecosystems. And I think we're just realising how difficult that is. It's very easy to fuck up an ecosystem. You just get in there and, rip it to shreds and do what you want with it from a very particular point of view, satisfying a very particular set of needs. To then put it back together again, to put back together systems that have evolved over billions of years with all their complexity is like, it opens up a whole new realm of science and creativity and construction and experimentation. So I don't think that the reconstruction and the design of ecosystems is a kind of an Arcadian project. I think it's highly technical and complicated and interesting, and but there are some grand narratives that have to be kind of gotten out of the way for this to become a major historical movement, in the sense that humans will try to become stewards of a healthy planet, which is both in their own interests but also in the interests of the non-human world. So to extend our love of life from the human to all living things is the philosophical shift, the spiritual shift that is taking place and has to take place. But there are three sort of narratives that get in our way, and I think one is that in terms of the world's religions, that paradise is still otherworldly. And I don't think it is, I think it's right here. That's the first one. The second one is obviously capitalist, in the sense that just economies of growth don't appear to work. Like they're just starting to hit up against really hard limits. And so economics has to also be revolutionised or reimagined and rendered. I mean, I'm sort of with Latour. Things have to be brought back to earth. And I don't mean in a kind of hippy-trippy new age way. I mean in appreciating the complexity of the earth system as the meta-narrative to which we have to, we have to fit in with that somehow as we redesign it. And then the third narrative is, of course, the idea that we're just going to expand the frontiers of life and jet off to other planets and we're going to have off-world living, which I think is bullshit. And I don't know why all of our richest people are obsessed with it. And it's a shame that there's still a culture that perceives the Earth as kind of boring. Why do you want to go into space when we already are in space? I mean, anyway.
Maybe I was just wondering whether any of the world's richest people were with us tonight. They can answer that question. Look, I'm conscious of time, I think. I mean, I would love to open questions up to the floor. I don't want to hold us back from the exhibition, nor drinks on the roof, nor purchasing books. But if anyone has questions from the floor or a question to Richard about this book or his extensive practice, yell out. Yes.
I'm really curious about how you came up with your lists.
The 120 places.
Yes, if that's the number, yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, so I've been teaching a class for probably 25 years, and in that class I take the students to places around the world which I think manifest both the beauty and the horror of contemporary culture. And through that, over time, I've accumulated an interest in certain places. But I knew I came to the project with a bunch of places that I would have put in this book no matter what. But I was also fortunate enough to work with a team of researchers who are very bright young things in the United States in a very good university for quite a long time, and I was able to draw on their view of the world, and that opened up to me a whole range of places that I wouldn't have known about or necessarily included, so I then followed their advice. And that reminds me that the book is a little bit American. There's a lot of places in America, but I don't like that, and there's not much in Australia, but I've been reflecting on why that is. And one of the reasons is that America is an extreme place and it's an extreme culture. So it follows that you would find a lot of places there that manifest extreme aspects of humanity. And Australia is very moderate. And it's one of perhaps the great strengths of Australian culture is that we are moderate. Sometimes it's a lack of experimentation, it just translates as conservatism. I get that. But on the other hand, when you think, let's make a list of places in Australia that relate to contemporary culture, you sort of start thinking, well, it's hard to make a list, because I'm currently working on an Australian version of this project. And it's very hard. So in fact, Tatum and I are doing it. We're not landing on particular places so much as more like generic things, like the Australian road or, something like that, which is generic, because that's an interesting thing, but not particular places. The other answer to your question, I think, goes to this issue of curating any kind of contemporary project, whether you're making a building or a landscape or a painting or a film or whatever you're doing now, fashion, anything, interior design. To what degree should you be honest about the state of the world? And to what degree should you be free from that and keep the arts on track with all of the beautiful things? And so this book tries to walk a line between, trying not to overindulge in the horror story. Like Auschwitz is in the book, okay? I could not do the book without it being in there, I decided. But, and so are many of the places that are synonymous with the extreme pollution of the Anthropocene. But it's not what I call anthroporn. It's not slowing down to just look at the car crash, There's a lot of good things, and we try to strike a balance. It's hard. It's really hard to do that. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but that was, and then you just say, okay, there's 120 places now. We have to get on with it. And we do it. Commit to those places. And I would add, there's more I'd add now, or some I'd take out, but upon reflection.
I can't wait to see the Australian version.
Yeah.
I was thinking that the Australian hyperobject is the Chico roll.
Chico.
It contains the universe. I just want to return to the design thing, 'cause I think
Yep.
I don't want to let you off the hook quite so easily. So, look, design is about luxury objects, and yes, design's about propping up capitalism and consumption and all these things. But arguably, your World Park, yes, World Park, not Global Park, so this is Richard has a sideline project, which is to take some of the mega eco projects that he discusses and has talked about and are in the book. So I suppose the one that people might be familiar with is the Great Green Wall across the top of the African desert. You've got a proposition that's about extending that as a gesture that literally connects the dots around the globe. That's design thinking, isn't it? Like that's a speculation that's come out of a spatial and hopeful kind of gesture. You put those things together and it seems to be attracting attention and capital, and there's a momentum behind it. So clearly design and landscape architecture, let's say, as a discipline, has a role to play here.
Right.
Like,
Well, I think all of the design disciplines do, but landscape architecture in particular, if I can be specific to my own discipline, it suffers from the messianic, and it always has since Ian McHarg in the 1960s developed a methodology by which we would literally save the world if we just got the mapping right. And that's kind of true. You should put civilization here, not there. It's not that hard. You don't build in floodplains, you don't build on steep slopes, and you don't knock over forests. And so we can reorganise civilization tomorrow according to some very simple rules, and it'll be a better place. The world doesn't work like that, of course. Everything's much more chaotic. The power of design is only second to the power of language. So design is a responsibility, a creative responsibility, and I think it can happen within a square metre, which is just as important now as world parks. We're referring to a project that I've worked on as a research project, which is on a large scale, only because I thought, well, the conservation movement is working at that scale, but there's no design in it. There's no design intelligence in the conservation movement. There's just ad hoc struggle to save places and to arrest them from exploitation. And that gives you a very pockmarked map of the world with all these isolated fragments of protected area. And those protected areas are a problem with climate change because all the species that are protected in them can't move, and they need to move with climate change, so we need pathways between them all. So you've got to join all the dots. And I've been able to draw that on a planetary scale and relate it to humans in the sense that humans would walk these trails and bike these trails on a planetary scale. And so it's not a brilliant idea. A lot of designers would come up with a similar strategy if we asked them. So design intelligence, I think, is a really valuable thing, and landscape architects in particular. It's just that landscape architecture is beholden to certain forces that tend to trivialise it, which is a shame.
I think on that note of both optimism and pessimism, I'd like to, one question.
Yeah,
Front row.
question. Yeah, sure. No.
Because we're living in this post-industrialist sublime, as you've discussed.
Yep.
With this proposed design project on a planetary scale, do you think that the true concept of the sublime is going to be able to be obtained in that, because we will have such a intimate understanding, or will it be lost, like the true concept of the sublime?
I think we're in a cultural moment where the sublime, I don't want to get too stuck on the sublime, but I think it's relevant to the cultural moment because we're scaring ourselves. It's not God's power with Mount Vesuvius, and it's now we're scared of ourselves. We're truly frightened by our own capability to, it's not sensational. We have the capability to destroy the planet. And in fact, if we listen to the scientific community, it's happening slowly but surely by virtue of climate change. Now, so that seems to me to qualify for that. It's almost, I don't know what that is. That's the banality of evil on the one hand, because we're all just going about. You can kill a planet by just dropping your kids off at school. You know, so we're all implicated. But it's also sublime in the sense that it's epic. I mean, in a universal sense, if life, as I said before, if life is valuable and we're threatening it on such an epic scale, then that's really is sublime. I don't know what that means, and I don't know what we do with that. But it's the sort of thing that if you're doing creative work, you kind of have to take on board in some way. Without messaging, you see, that's the problem. We can't just continue to message stuff. No one's interested in that.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah,
for
thanks,
talking.
everyone.
Please join us in the gallery. Please join us purchasing books. Please ascend for a drink on the roof, and please join me in thanking Richard Weller.
And thank you, Mark. Thanks.